I overheard her lying to her mother on a Tuesday evening in November, and I want to be clear that I wasn't trying to listen. The walls in our building are not thin. They're old brick, solid, the kind of walls that usually do their job quietly and without complaint. But the hallway carried sound in a particular way, especially when someone was standing close to their door, which she apparently was and which I apparently was too, having just come home and not yet turned my key. So I heard it, all of it. And when her door opened 30 seconds later and she found me standing in the hallway looking like someone who had absolutely just heard everything, I made a decision that I cannot fully explain even now. With the benefit of hindsight and the understanding of how it ended, I knocked on my own door, which was already open, and said, "I think I can help with that." She stared at me. And that was how it started. Let me go back 3 weeks, because the hallway moment means nothing without the context of who we were before it. My name is Marcus. I'm 33 years old. I work in urban planning for the city, mostly infrastructure projects, occasionally something interesting, and I live on the second floor of an apartment building in a neighborhood that's old enough to have character and new enough to have good coffee. I moved in 14 months before the Tuesday in November. My apartment is comfortable in the specific way of places that belong to people who spend most of their time somewhere else. Tidy, functional, not particularly personal. I had a couch I liked, a desk I used too much, a kitchen I was improving at, and a general sense that my life was proceeding in the right direction at a reasonable pace. I was not looking for anything to complicate that. Then Simone moved into 2C. She moved in on a Saturday in August, which I know because I was home all day and I heard the process. Doors, boxes, the particular acoustics of furniture being dragged across hardwood. I dropped something that landed with enough weight to make me look up from my desk. I didn't introduce myself until the following Monday, when we ended up at the elevator at the same time and she was carrying a lamp that was exactly 1 inch too tall to fit inside without tilting, and I held the door while she figured out the angle. It was salmon-colored, the lamp, and slightly ugly in the specific way of objects that have been loved long enough to become non-negotiable. We exchanged names and floors and the specific pleasantries of two people who are going to live 12 feet apart and are deciding in real time what kind of relationship that will be. She was warm but economical. She said what she meant and not much else. I stood in the elevator with the lamp between us and thought, this person does not waste words, which I found immediately and involuntarily interesting. In the weeks after that, we became functional neighbors. We held the elevator. We accepted packages for each other. Once, when her key stuck in the lock on a rainy Wednesday, I happened to be in the hallway and helped, and she said thank you in the direct way she said everything and went inside. And I stood in the hallway for a moment with the faint sensation of having done something right without being sure what. We talked sometimes at the mailboxes. We ran into each other at the corner grocery and walked back together once, sharing nothing more personal than opinions about the new construction on the next block, which she hated on architectural grounds I didn't fully follow, but found interesting to listen to. She worked at an architecture firm, I eventually learned, junior associate, long hours, the kind of job that demands a lot and gives back in complicated ways. She was 29. She had moved here from across the city for the job, which I understood, having done something similar 3 years earlier. We had the easy rapport of people who share a context without sharing a life. There were things I noticed without deciding to. The way she walked back from work on the evenings I happened to be looking out the window, not fast, not slow, but purposeful, like someone who had made peace with the commute and was using it. The specific arrangement of her Tuesday recycling, which told me she cooked properly on Sundays and ate simply for the rest of the week. The light in her apartment at night, usually on until 11, the particular lamp on the side table visible through the gap in her curtains, warm and slightly strange-colored in a way I couldn't account for from the outside. I noticed these things the way you notice the details of the space you inhabit, without it meaning anything particular. That is what I told myself. I did not think about her more than was reasonable for someone I saw 3 or 4 times a week in passing. I want to say that clearly before the Tuesday in November, because afterwards everything looks different from the outside, and I want you to understand how genuinely ordinary the 3 weeks before it were. The thing is, ordinary has a texture too, October in that building had the particular texture of two people becoming incrementally more familiar without either of them deciding to. We'd started nodding at each other the way people nod when they no longer need to introduce themselves. She'd started leaving her door open on Sunday afternoons. Not wide, just an inch, the way you do when you're home, and you don't mind the world knowing it. I'd noticed. I'd left mine open too once on a Sunday when I was working at my desk, and the weather had turned warm enough to justify it. And approximately 40 minutes later, she'd knocked, the open door apparently functioning as the signal she'd intended, and asked if I had a bottle opener she could borrow. I did. She returned it that evening with a sticky note on it that said "thank you" in her handwriting, which was the same handwriting I'd later see in the margins of the architectural drawings, small and precise and leaning slightly forward like it was always in a hurry to get to the next word. I kept the sticky note. I'm aware of how that sounds. What I heard, standing in the hallway with my key not yet in the lock, was this. Simone, voice slightly lower than usual, the way voices get when someone is trying to sound casual about something that isn't casual, telling her mother that yes, she was fine, yes, she was happy, yes, she had been seeing someone. The someone was named David, she said, and he was an architect, which her mother would appreciate. And things were going well, very well, actually. And she was happy, she said again. And then her voice did a very particular thing that voices do when a sentence is technically true and emotionally completely false. And I heard her mother ask if she would bring him to Thanksgiving. And there was a pause that lasted about 3 seconds too long. And Simone said of course she would ask him. She was sure he'd love to come. Then her door opened and she found me. I should tell you what her face did in that moment because it mattered. There was the initial shock, wide eyes, the stillness of someone caught mid-performance. And then, behind the shock, something that wasn't quite embarrassment and wasn't quite relief. Something more complicated. Something that looked, for just a second, like the expression of a person who has been managing something alone for a long time and has suddenly, unexpectedly, been seen. I said, "I think I can help with that." She looked at me for a long moment. You heard all of that. The hallway carries sound. How much? From David the architect to Thanksgiving. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. This is incredibly embarrassing. It doesn't have to be, I said. And then, because it was either the worst or best idea I'd had in months, I work in urban planning. That's close enough to architecture that your mother probably won't know the difference. She stared at me. Thanksgiving is 3 weeks away, I said. We could establish a convincing history by then. You're serious. I'm offering. Why? That was a fair question, and I didn't have an entirely clean answer to it. The honest answer was something like, because I've been watching you manage everything alone for 3 months, and I would like just once to be useful to you in a way you can't refuse. But that was too much to say in a hallway on a Tuesday evening, so I said, because you seem like you need one, and I have nothing better to do at Thanksgiving. She looked at me for another long moment. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere above us, someone was cooking something with garlic. This is a terrible idea, she said. Probably. It's going to be complicated. Most things are. My mother is very perceptive. I'm told I'm a convincing person. She made a sound that was almost a laugh and not quite. Then she stepped back from her door. Come in, she said. If we're doing this, we need to establish some ground rules. I went in. Her apartment was the mirror image of mine in layout and completely different in everything else. It was lived in the way mine wasn't. Books stacked in ways that suggested actual use. Prints on the walls that had been chosen rather than just placed. The salmon-colored lamp from the elevator on a side table where it somehow worked. There was a half-finished glass of wine on the kitchen counter and a project spread across the coffee table, architectural drawings with handwritten notes in the margins. She cleared space on the sofa and I sat down, and she sat in the chair across from me and picked up her wine glass and held it without drinking from it and said, "Rules." Rules, I agreed. First, this is temporary. It ends after Thanksgiving. Whatever story we build it with an expiration date. Agreed. Second, you have approval rights over nothing. I'm telling my mother what I decide to tell her. You're filling in a role, not writing the script. Understood. Third, this doesn't change anything between us here. We're still neighbors. This is a project with a deadline. Fine. She looked at me steadily. Why are you being so agreeable? I'm an agreeable person. You've had 3 stipulations presented to you and accepted all of them without negotiating a single one. They all seemed reasonable. She was quiet for a moment. She set the wine glass down without drinking from it, which was the second time she'd done that, and I noticed it the same way I noticed the lamp and the drawings and the fact that she'd cleared space on the sofa without asking whether I preferred the chair. She made decisions easily. She just moved through the world making them. Why did you really knock? She said. I thought about it. Because you had a 3-second pause when your mother asked about Thanksgiving, I said. And I've heard people pause like that before, and it doesn't usually mean things are fine. She looked at me. Something shifted in her face. Not dramatically, just a small adjustment, the kind that happens when someone recalibrates what they thought they were dealing with. Okay, she said. Here's what she knows. His name is David. He's an architect. We've been together about 4 months. He's kind, she's told her, and thoughtful. And he listens, which apparently she mentions specifically. The listening detail is good, I said. It's specific. Hard to fake, you think? The generic ones are easy. Kind, thoughtful, those are words. The specific ones take a person. She was looking at me with that expression again, recalibrating. You listen, she said. It wasn't a question. It's something I try to do. We talked for 2 hours. It started as logistics, establishing the story, agreeing on details, building the architecture of a convincing 3 months. And somewhere in the second hour, it stopped being logistics and started being something else, which neither of us acknowledged. She told me how she'd ended up at the architecture firm. A professor in her 3rd year who'd told her she had a specific talent for understanding how people moved through space, which she said at the time she thought was a polite way of saying something she couldn't place, and had only recently understood as a real observation. I told her how I'd ended up in planning, not by design, but by a sequence of choices that each seemed small and had added up to something that turned out to fit. She asked questions that were more specific than people's questions usually were, which told me she was actually processing what I said and not just holding it until it was her turn again. She told me about the relationship that had ended 8 months ago, 7 years, which is long enough that ending it changes the shape of your days in ways you keep discovering. And she said it without drama or lingering pain, just as fact, the way she said most things. And she said she was fine now, genuinely fine, but that her mother worried with an intensity that was well-intentioned and specific and quietly exhausting, and that one evening she'd said I've been seeing someone as a shortcut and then couldn't take it back without a conversation she wasn't ready for. She'd been maintaining the fiction for 6 weeks. The architect detail had been an improvisation she'd immediately regretted. The Thanksgiving invitation was the thing that had broken the dam. She's going to want to meet him, I said. She already has. In theory. She thinks he's been to dinner at my place twice. I looked at her kitchen. The lamb, she said, following my gaze. Apparently I made lamb. She was impressed. Do you cook? I can follow a recipe. Lamb is ambitious. I know. I may have oversold David, I laughed. She looked at me when I did, and then she smiled, which was the first real smile I'd seen from her since the hallway. And it was different from the polite warmth of mailbox conversations. It was unguarded in a way that rearranged something. I noted it and said nothing about it, which was, I think, the right call. The 2 weeks before Thanksgiving were the most specific weeks of my life in recent memory, by which I mean I have never been so aware of every detail. We had coffee 3 times to fill in the story. Her mother would ask questions, she said, and we needed answers that matched. We established that we had met at a work event, which was vague enough to be unverifiable and specific enough to be plausible, that I had asked for her number and then not used it for a week, which she said was the kind of thing her mother would find both maddening and charming. that our first proper date had been dinner at a place in the neighborhood that we both actually knew, which meant when her mother asked what we'd ordered, we would have real answers. The first coffee was at the place on the corner, a Tuesday morning, and we sat by the window and she had a legal pad and a pen, and I said, "You're taking notes." And she said, "One of us should." And I said she was probably right, but that I preferred to just remember things. And she put the pen down and looked at me and said, "Fine, then remember this." And she talked for an hour. I remembered everything. The second coffee was at her kitchen table on a Thursday evening. No notes, just the two of us going over the story again until it stopped sounding like a story and started sounding like something that had happened. The third was on a Sunday afternoon, and by then we were barely reviewing. We were just talking. She mentioned something about the city she'd grown up in, and I asked a question, and she answered and asked one back, and we were there for 2 hours, and covered almost none of the material, and neither of us mentioned it. When we left, we spent an evening walking through the neighborhood so I could learn the things a boyfriend would know. The bakery she liked. The bench in the park where she ate lunch sometimes. The bookshop she went to on Saturdays. The fact that she didn't drink coffee after noon, or sleep with the windows fully closed, or ever watch anything with subtitles when she was tired. I took none of this as notes. I just listened because listening was the thing she'd said the invented David did, and I found that it wasn't difficult. She talked about herself the way she talked about everything, economically, without performance, expecting you to keep up. I learned other things that weren't part of the assignment. That she ate lunch at her desk 4 days out of 5 and went for a walk on the 5th as a kind of compensation. That she had strong and specific opinions about how cities should feel at night, not just look. How light worked on people's bodies moving through space. How sound shaped whether a place felt safe. That she had wanted to be an architect since she was 11 years old and had never second-guessed it, which was the kind of certainty I found both foreign and quietly admirable. That she laughed rarely in the mailbox pleasantries register, but often and easily once she decided you were worth it. I was paying close attention, which was something I did professionally and now appeared to be doing personally, and I told myself this was in service of the project. It was only partly true. We stopped at the bookshop. She wanted to show me, she said, because her mother would ask if he'd been there. The owner was exactly as described, a woman in her 70s who looked up from behind the counter and said to Simone, "You brought someone," with the equanimity of someone for whom nothing was particularly surprising anymore, and then looked at me for a moment and said, "Architecture?" And Simone said, "Close enough," and the woman nodded like that settled something. On the way out, Simone said she'd been making that kind of pronouncement for 15 years, and nobody had ever understood the system. I said maybe the system was just paying attention. She looked at me sideways when I said it, and I looked back, and we kept walking. There was an evening, midway through the second week, when we were going over the story for what was probably the 4th time, and she stopped mid-sentence and said, "You already know this." "I know. I've told you all of this." "You have. Then why am I telling you again?" "I think," I said, "because the story keeps becoming more real each time you tell it." She looked at me across the coffee table. The drawings were still spread there, her handwriting in the margins, and the lamp was on and the apartment was warm, and outside it was the particular cold of mid-November that makes indoor spaces feel more significant than they would otherwise. "That's an uncomfortable observation," she said. "I know. It implies that the line is blurring. Does it bother you?" She thought about it for a moment with the seriousness she brought to things that deserved it. "No," she said. "That's what bothers me. I didn't say anything to that. But I noted it. The way I noted everything." On the third evening, over wine at her kitchen table, she said, "Can I ask you something that's outside the project?" "Sure. Do you do this often?" "Step in. Not really. I'm usually the person who walks past. So why didn't you?" I turned my glass on the table. "I don't know exactly. Something about the pause. The 3-second pause. It was more like 4, I said, and it had a specific quality. Like something that had been held a long time and was running out of space." She looked at me across the kitchen table with the lamp behind her, and I thought about the light I'd seen through her curtain all those evenings. That warm and slightly strange color I hadn't been able to account for from outside. Now I was inside it, and it made complete sense, and I understood, for the first time, that it was the lamp that was strange, not the light. "David would say something like that," she said quietly. "I know. You've gotten very good at this. I told you I was a convincing person. You did." She looked at her glass, then back at me. "Marcus? Yeah, I need you to know something before we go to Thanksgiving." "Okay. I haven't missed him," she said. "David, the real one. The 7 years. I haven't missed him in a long time." "But I've missed—" She stopped. Started again. "I've missed having someone who paid attention, specifically, not generally, the way you're doing." I looked at her across the kitchen table. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because you should know what you're walking into. If the line is blurring as you said, you should know what's on the other side of it." "What's on the other side of it?" I said. She held my gaze for a moment. "Someone who is very tired of managing things alone." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the city made its night sounds. The lamp gave its warm, slightly unpredictable light. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me," I said. "I know," she said. "I thought you'd earned it." Thanksgiving was at her parents' place, 2 hours outside the city. We drove up on a Wednesday evening, and the drive had the quality of something that was simultaneously very ordinary. 2 people in a car on a highway, and entirely not, because we had spent 2 weeks building a shared past and were now about to perform it, together, under real conditions. She had dressed carefully, which I noticed and said nothing about. I had dressed as myself, which seemed like the right approach. For the first 40 minutes, we ran through things quietly, the way actors might run lines. And then she said, "Okay, I think we're ready," and turned the radio on low. And we didn't talk much for the rest of the drive, which was its own kind of ease. There's a specific comfort in being in a car with someone and not needing to fill the silence. I thought about that. I thought about the hallway and the lamp and the evening she'd said the line wasn't bothering her, and that was what bothered her. I thought about what I would do when this was over, when the expiration date arrived and we went back to being neighbors, and the story we'd built got folded up and put away. I didn't have a clean answer to that. I let the question sit. Her mother was a woman who looked like Simone was going to look in 30 years, which is to say sharp and warm and entirely capable of seeing through things. She hugged Simone and then turned to me and did the specific thing that perceptive mothers do. A full assessment in about 2 seconds. The kind that has nothing to do with how you look and everything to do with how you stand. I met it without flinching. She said it was very nice to meet me, and she said it like she meant it, and also like she was reserving judgment, which I respected. Her father was easier. He asked what I did, and I explained planning. And he asked a question about infrastructure that was genuinely informed, and we talked about it for 10 minutes. Which I think helped more than anything else I could have done. Her mother watched us talk and something in her face settled. Just slightly in the way faces settle, when a concern is not resolved but is perhaps reclassified. Dinner was long and warm in the specific way of family dinners, where people know each other well enough to argue. Comfortably, her parents had opinions about the city's development that were different from mine, and we went 3 rounds on a zoning question, while Simone watched with an expression I recognized, as the one she wore when something was more interesting than she'd expected. Her father had the same directness she had, which explained where it came from. Her mother had the warmth underneath it, which explained the rest. Dinner was good. Her mother asked the questions I had been told to expect. How we'd met, what I'd thought of Simone when we first met, what our first date had been like. I answered all of them truthfully wherever I could, which was most of the time, because the true story and the story we'd constructed had more overlap than I'd expected. The work event was close enough to an elevator and a stuck key. The not calling for a week was close enough to the weeks of passing each other at mailboxes. The dinner in the neighborhood was a real place we'd both actually been to. And when her mother asked what we'd ordered, I remembered what Simone had told me. And it came out naturally enough that her mother smiled. At one point during the meal, her mother asked Simone something about the firm, a project she'd mentioned on the phone. And Simone answered, and her mother turned to me and said, "She doesn't talk about work with most people, you know." And I said, "I know. I think she waits to see if you're going to actually listen before she decides it's worth it." And her mother looked at me for a moment and then looked at Simone. And Simone was looking at her plate, and her mother said, "That's exactly right." And something passed between the three of us that I hadn't planned for and couldn't have. After dinner, while her parents were in the kitchen, Simone and I stood on the back porch in the November cold, and she said, "You didn't have to say that." It was true. That's not the same as having to say it. "No," I said. "It isn't." She looked at the yard. It was dark and cold, the grass still and silver-edged with frost. She had a glass of wine she wasn't drinking. The third time that evening she'd held something without consuming it, which was a pattern I had by now learned meant she was processing. And I had my hands in my jacket pockets, and the porch light was on behind us, and somewhere inside her parents were doing dishes. The clatter of it coming through muffled and warm, and the yard was completely still. "My mother likes you," she said. "I know. She doesn't like most people quickly." I could tell. She asked me, "When you were talking to my father about the zoning thing," she leaned over and said, "He listens to you." "Not at you." I didn't say anything. "I told her that's how he is," Simone said. "And then I realized I was talking about you like you were actually David." In that moment, I basically was. "No," she said. "In that moment, you were you. That's the problem." She turned the wine glass in her hands. "We built a character and then you just didn't play it. You played yourself, and it turned out the character was you anyway." The yard was still. The frost was silver on the grass. She said very quietly, "Marcus?" "Yeah." "What are we doing?" And I said, because it was the only honest answer, "I don't know. But I think it stopped being a project somewhere around the third evening." She was quiet for a moment. The yard was still. "Somewhere in the house her parents were doing dishes. The lamp," she said. "What?" "When you came in that first night. You looked at the lamp and you didn't say anything about it." I didn't want to say the wrong thing. Most people say something. "I know. I've had it for 4 years. My last boyfriend hated it. He called it the unfortunate salmon." "It grows on you," I said. She turned to look at me. In the porch light, her face was the face of someone who had been managing the distance between what was real and what was performed for long enough that she'd forgotten they were different things, and was only now, standing in the November cold, remembering. "The expiration date," she said. "Yes, I think I'd like to renegotiate that." I looked at her. She held my gaze with the directness she held everything. "We'd have to tell your mother," I said. "I know. And your mother is going to have feelings about having been managed. I know that too. This is going to be complicated. You said most things are." She was right. I had said that in the hallway on the Tuesday in November, when I had knocked on my own door and made an offer I couldn't fully explain. And I had been right then, and I was right now. Because things were complicated. Her mother did have feelings, which we navigated over a long phone call the following week that Simone told me about afterward in pieces, spread across 3 evenings and a lot of tea. The first piece, her mother had said she would have preferred the truth, which was fair. The second piece, 2 days later, her mother had also said she had liked me at dinner anyway, which Simone reported with a look that was equal parts smug and mortified. The third piece, on a Friday evening when she knocked on my door and came in and sat in the chair across from the sofa like she had on the first night, her mother had said, which Simone told me last, voice slightly careful, "The thing he said about you and work. That wasn't something you could have told him to say." And Simone had said no, she hadn't. And her mother had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Good. Those are the details that matter." And then after another pause, "Is it real?" And Simone had said she was working on figuring that out. And her mother had said, "Let me know when you do." She told me all of this, sitting in my chair on a Friday evening in December. And when she finished, she looked at me and said, "She wants to have dinner." When we're ready. I said that sounded like her mother approving in advance of something she'd officially been deceived about. Simone said yes, that was a pretty accurate summary. I said I found that impressive. She said her mother was occasionally impossible to argue with about things she'd already decided, which was, she added, a trait that skipped a generation. I looked at her. She looked back. Apparently, she said, I have the same problem. I think about the first evening a lot. The way she'd made room on the sofa without asking what I preferred. The way she'd set down her wine glass without drinking from it every time something landed in a way she needed to sit with. The way she'd said this is a terrible idea and then opened the door anyway. Because she was, underneath the economics of how she spoke and moved, someone who trusted her own instincts when they were pointed in a clear enough direction. What I hadn't told her, on the porch in the November cold, was the specific moment I had realized the project had become something else. It was the evening in the second week when we were walking the neighborhood. The research walk, and she'd showed me the bookshop she went to on Saturdays and described the owner, a woman in her 70s who made unsolicited recommendations and was always right, and had never once been thanked for it with such particular warmth that I had stopped walking without meaning to. She'd taken 3 steps before she noticed and turned. What? She said. I said nothing, just started walking again. But I had stopped because I was looking at her and thinking, I want to know all of it. Not for the assignment, not for the story we were building, just because she was interesting in a specific, irreducible way that I hadn't encountered in a long time, and I was tired of only knowing the parts of her that fit through a hallway conversation. I didn't say any of that on the porch. I said, I think it stopped being a project somewhere around the 3rd evening, which was true but incomplete. The complete version would have taken longer than the November cold allowed, and she had already understood the relevant portion. We drove back the day after Thanksgiving. The highway was quieter than the night before, most of the traffic going the other direction, and she slept for the last 40 minutes with her head tilted slightly toward the window, and I drove and didn't turn the radio on. I kept the speed even. I took the smoother lanes. There's something about driving someone who is asleep that asks for care in a way that waking driving doesn't, not because they'd notice if you didn't, but because you would. Somewhere around the hour mark, she said. Half asleep, not quite conscious of having spoken. The lamp really does grow on you. And I said yes, it does, low enough not to wake her properly. And she made a small sound and didn't say anything else. I took that with me. We got back to the building at 9. She woke up when I pulled into the lot. That particular slow surfacing that happens when someone didn't mean to fall asleep and isn't sure how much time has passed. She looked at me and then at the building and said, We're back. I said yes. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the building, and then she said, I didn't thank you. I said she didn't need to. She said, I know. I'm going to anyway. She turned to look at me in the car in the parking lot at 9 on the night after Thanksgiving, and she said, Thank you for not making it feel like a performance. I looked at her. By the end of it, I said, it wasn't one. She held that for a moment, and then nodded once and got out of the car, and I sat there for a minute before following. We rode the elevator up in silence. At the landing between our doors, she stopped, and I stopped, and she said, Get some sleep, Marcus. I said I would. She went in. I stood in the hallway for a moment, the same hallway where I'd heard the pause. 4 seconds, like something running out of space. And then I went in too, and stood in my apartment that was tidy and functional and not particularly personal, and thought about all the ways things had shifted in 3 weeks without anyone formally deciding they would. The lamp is in my apartment now, on the side table by the window, and I have completely come around on it. The light it gives is warm and slightly unpredictable, and it makes the room feel inhabited in a specific way that I don't have a better word for. Simone says I've become loyal to it in a way that is embarrassing for a grown man. I told her I tend to be loyal to things that grow on me. She said that was the most on-brand thing I'd ever said. I told her she would know since she built the brand. She laughed, which she does more now than she did in the mailbox days, freely, without deciding to, like someone who has stopped budgeting warmth and is just spending it. I think about the Tuesday in November sometimes. The 4-second pause. The hallway that carried sound. The decision I made that I can't fully explain even now. Here is the closest I can get. I had been watching someone manage everything alone, and I knew what that looked like because I had done it myself for 3 years. And when I heard the pause, something in me recognized it. Not the lie, the thing under the lie. The particular exhaustion of being fine, always fine, never anything that requires another person to step closer. I recognized it because I had been it, and I was tired, in some part of myself I hadn't acknowledged, of being the person who walked past. So I knocked, and she let me in. And 3 weeks and 1 Thanksgiving later, neither of us could quite remember where the performance had ended and the real thing had begun. Which is, I think, the best possible outcome for a fiction you build carefully enough. It stops being distinguishable from the truth.